So moving on to our next session. So we talk about circular economy being a restorative and regenerative economy by design. And the clue sits in the last word as much as it sits in the beginning, so in the design part. So the next panel will be talking about designing for a circular city, which will be moderated by Ashima Sukdev, our program lead for the governments and cities.
Testing? Is this?
I can bring it to the side. I'll bring it.
Oh, thank you. Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for having us at this very first panel session of the Circular Economy European Summit. I wanted to first introduce myself. My name is Ashima Sukdev, and I'm the Governments and Cities Program Lead at the Ellen MacArthur Foundation. I have a fantastic panel with me here today to discuss designing for a circular city. Firstly, I'd like to introduce Chris Grantham, who's the Circular Economy Portfolio Director at IDEO. We also have Owen Zacharias from Delta Development Group, leading on innovation and sustainability, and Steve Boer from the Chief Executive of Opportunity Peterborough, from Peterborough City. So just to kick us off, I wanted to share a few initial perspectives on what we mean by design for a circular city. I think the term circular city has started to get thrown around quite a bit, so we really wanted to unpack what that actually means and what the vision for a circular city might be. I think really, in essence, the circular economy actually offers a chance for redesigning and rethinking how we sort of design and operate our urban systems. Some of the important elements that come through in this are designing a city to be regenerative, designing it to eliminate the idea of waste, to make sure that assets within the urban environment are kept at the highest value, you maintain that value, you optimize that value. And finally, and I think probably most important, is really generating positive value in the city for its citizens, generating positive experiences without the reliance on finite resources. So that's sort of the perspective that we take to the city today. I wanted to first start off by asking each of our speakers to share sort of their introductory statements, provide a little bit of background. Let's just see if these slides
is
work.
this on?
Yeah. Sorry, bear with us, technical. I'll actually start off with Chris while we wait for your slides to come up.
Okay.
Just a quick sort of couple of questions to you to introduce yourself to the audience and so on. So IDEO is a global design company that has made its name in creating positive impact through design. Can you share sort of an introductory perspective on firstly why design is actually so important to a circular city and sort of the urban environment on the whole? And then also perhaps touch on if we do sort of design for a circular city, what does this actually look like? What different forms could it take for a user or a citizen?
Okay. Hello, everybody. Can you hear me? Yeah, I think so. Thank you. IDEO is not an expert in circular cities design. We spend a lot of time thinking about human and technology systems and how they interact with each other, and we are really interested in how that plays out in terms of circular cities and the circular economy more generally. So we've been doing really a bit of design fiction type thinking, where we've been trying to think about those future systems and scenarios, and how the circular economy is really manifested in quite an incredible way potentially in circular cities, because we must the whole point of the circular economy is thinking about a regenerative economic system, not just a transactional one. And there are many forms of capital that can potentially be generated or regenerated in circular cities in terms of natural capital, human capital, social capital. And so it's a really interesting microcosm of where the thinking around the circular economy is really pushed into that more dynamic sort of headspace, I think. And so that's why we've been thinking quite a bit about it. And very much thinking then of the human scale narrative and how circular cities will offer a certain quality of life. You know, thinking about them as a life system as much as an economic system, and I guess. You know, they can take many forms. You know, there's opportunities to build new cities in India, for example, from scratch as circular cities, and that work's being done at the moment. Or there is a huge amount of work to be done potentially adapting cities to be more circular. And so I think design plays a role in thinking about, you know, that design task at a sort of at a city level, and thinking about not necessarily, of course, a top-down design task, but how one might design, you know, the conditions that can enable circularity, because of course the circular city should mirror the circular economy as an effective, resilient system. It's, you know, it's highly adaptive. Will have some major sort of open source thinking in it. It will be kind of extreme at different scales, so very much systems within systems. And obviously this kind of quote up there sort of shows an example of how, in many ways, circular cities will be kind of connected internationally in terms of you know, design communities and database communities, but then also incredibly kind of localized. And you know, when I talk about sort of creating forms of human capital, social capital, even though those words are deceptive, I think this is about creating places where people can connect more with each other. It's new forms of citizenship around shared you know, economic and social interests, and I think that's really interesting given the political events of this year. So I think there's lots of ways in which we need to think about designing circular cities in a different way than we would traditionally think about creating the industrial cities of the past, and maybe they won't be so densely created either. And there's lots of sort of interesting thinking about how on-grid we will need to be, and thinking about little mesh networks within cities that can support some smaller communities. So I think these are themes I can come back to later.
Absolutely. There's a lot that we have to unpack there. I wanted to move on next to Owen. So as a large-scale sort of real estate developer, I think it would be great if you could spend some time firstly telling us a little bit about the work that you are doing with Delta Development, and also sort of explaining to us, as a real estate developer, what does it actually look like to apply circular economy principles in an urban environment when you're thinking about buildings and real estate development, essentially?
Yeah, great. Now, while we're getting the slides set up, good morning, everybody. I'm really glad, Ash, that you started with the people, because in fact, as a real estate developer, I believe very much that I'm in the people business. I just happen to build buildings for them. But really, our assets are not necessarily assets unto themselves. They need to be buildings and structures for people. Without them, we don't really have any value taking place within those buildings. So when we are really thinking about design and of our places, we're designing our structures from the inside out for the people first, and then we wrap those environments in a sort of cladding. And then from there, it's about how do these buildings interact with their communities and interact also on market levels as well.
Sorry, I think Casper, can you click the slides by any chance? I'm not sure. Thanks. I think if you go to the end and then have to hit play on one of the other ones. All right. Oh, and if you don't mind chatting for a bit while we sort out the slides.
Okay. So Delta Development Group, we're a private, family-owned real estate development company. We met an individual named William McDonough, who is an architect and one of the co-creators of Cradle to Cradle, about 15 years ago. And while we had bought the old Fokker aircraft facility out of bankruptcy when Fokker went bankrupt, and our speciality is really in large-scale area transformation. We do massive projects from anywhere between 3.5 square hectares to 3.5 square kilometers of area development. So these are projects that take an immense amount of time to conceptualize and then to create as well and realize. I'll show you one today, which is a project we've been working on now for about 10 years, and it's called Park 2020. It's 92,000 square meters located by Amsterdam Schiphol Airport, and it is, here we go. And so while we just heard from Chris a little bit more about the people and the value that is undoubtedly centralized there, I'll talk a little bit more about the assets so that we can push this discussion in another direction. Here is the park that we're looking to create. It's about 5.5 square hectares. It's 92,000 square meters, and right now the area is zoned for commercial real estate, so it's an office park and it's full service, so there are things like restaurants and daycare and sport facilities, everything that people may need to enjoy a day with their colleagues, not a day away from their families. The guiding principle that we've always used is cradle to cradle. We at Delta we view ourselves as high quality real estate developers, and in that respect we use the cradle to cradle design principles as our quality control mechanisms. We believe much more in this instead of a term of Six Sigma, because for us it's much more about setting the correct intentions in the beginning. So if you're actually working Six Sigma with the wrong intentions, then you're actually perfectly wrong. So that for us it's an important place to start from. What do we want to achieve, and then become busy on how do we optimize quality characteristics. And we see cradle to cradle as a way to do so. And we also see cradle to cradle as sort of the design paradigm for the circular economy. There are a number of examples out there in terms of products, in terms of companies that are reorganizing their systems according to cradle-to-cradle design, and these companies are also very well positioned to grow within the circular economy. So we have partnered with a lot of these companies, and we have also done the same. I'll go a little bit now through our value propositions that we have at Park 2020. First and foremost, in the asset, we want to optimize the function and the characteristics of the square meters itself, of the building. From that, we actually optimize then also how the building functions itself in terms of its carrying costs. So these are things of low maintenance costs, low energy costs, those types of assets. Of course, the people play a central role in our business case development and everything that we do for value creation. And the one that I'd like to talk about today, because I've got to choose, is residual value. And this is an interesting characteristic that Cradle to Cradle and the circular economy brings up, because in my world, at the end of the use period of these buildings, we already have a negative book value of the asset. It's typically listed as demolition expenses. So when somebody will buy a new building, they decouple the land from the building, and the land will have a certain amount of value, and then the building is really valued at how much is it going to cost to knock it down or transform it. But we never look at these beautiful, wonderful materials in there as assets themselves. So we've been looking at how do we design buildings in order to recover these resources and these valuable resources and make a new play and a new business case. And we're looking at this to be sort of the future banks of materials, where we can start mining the current stock of assets in cities and in suburbs in order to create those new buildings. And this is really a very interesting play, not only on valuation of property, but also agility and flexibility of the built environment as well. So to set this tone, if we look back at what our industry was, it was really a craft that evolved over time. And it was really something that, and our societies developed very, very slowly, and we were able to add stock to that. But the pace at which our world develops today is increasingly complex. It's very, very fast, yet we still build our assets for some period of 100 years. And I don't know really who came up with this number of 100 years, but it's always what we were taught in real estate courses, or what we talk about in terms of financing, built for 100 years. But really, our world is it changes so rapidly that we have trouble distinguishing what even 10 years looks like. And the result is that we believe that this model, this disconnect that we're building long-term fixed assets for in a short-term transaction model for a world that is changing ever more rapidly, is really a collision course, and it's like driving 200 kilometers an hour in the fog. And the results then are something that we see, that these assets are not necessarily properly designed and developed to be transformed. So once they become vacant, they often sit on the market for long periods, becoming structurally vacant for a number of years, and they can't be transformed without really having to put a lot of money into those buildings. So the transformation business case becomes compromised. And the second is really the compromising, again, the value of these resources. This is actually some dated info. It came from 2010, but it's still the best indication that I can see. It's 3 different graphs. The bar chart shows the consumption rates of different metals. The inside circle chart has 2 circles. One, the outside circle is how many years left do we have of these resources. The inside at that time would be how many years would we have if the rest of the world went to half of the consumption of the United States. And on the your far right is then the recycling rates of these assets. And I pick on copper because copper's easy. It's the yellow bar on the left. It's the 3rd most consumed metal. On the inside, there are about 61 years of copper left in this. 2/3 of our copper is actually already out of the ground. That's pretty scary to think of. And we're only recycling this at a rate of 31%. So we're not really treating this valuable resource as we should. And as a business person, I look at this and go, whoa, how does this look on markets? And here we go. I took this morning from my hotel room. This is really the latest insight of these commodity markets. And this is copper trading over the last 15 years. And I take 15 years because we're taking typically a 15-year lease on the buildings. So it would be in 2001, what if we bought our copper, put it into the buildings in a way that it could be recovered? What would be the result at 2016 from an economic perspective? Well, EU inflation has risen over that time at 26.77%, so rounding up to about 27%, yet the value of copper at the same time has raised over 182%. So there's a strong business case there to be able to be made. And here is steel. We see steel also rising well. And here's one rebar. This is the stuff that we put into the actual concrete to keep the concrete in place. But we've never designed rebar to be actually disassembled from concrete or be recovered. So here you start to see the compromising relationship between design and actually being able to recap those, recover those assets and monetize them in the future. And when you start looking at this, you start looking at a sort of residual value cascade from reoccupy the building at its first intended purpose, an office building as an office building. But at Delta, we are actually already building all of our office buildings from the design parameters to be future housing. So the buildings can be transformed into housing if the office market erodes. So therefore, our investors can quickly and easily transform these assets into office buildings. Then they can break off components or even look at materials and bring those materials back to build the future stock. So here it is. These are the initial designs of all of our buildings, and we're about 50% complete. But what you see from the beginning is our buildings are always designed to be deconstructed right from the get-go, and we are identifying the amount of technical resources and biological resources in these structures. We're tracking those assets and find out where they are in the building, how they come together, how they come apart, how much time should they be spending in there, because different assets move in different time frames through the building. And we've partnered with IBM because they're much smarter at that than we are. We're just a developer. So partner with people that are better than you. That's a tip. And then again, we're also looking at how do we transform the concept of ownership. So we've now, together with our lawyers, together with our investors, together with Mitsubishi, started making something that we're very excited about. And right now, we are actually leasing vertical transport instead of actually buying lifts for our buildings. So this is another practical example.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Owen. There's a lot of content there that we want to get to later as well. Steve, so we've heard a bit from Chris in terms of sort of the human aspects of this and the kind of community that we're designing and what a circular city might look like. We've heard from Owen as well on some of the motivations behind designing circular, what their organization is doing too. Could you tell us a little bit about Peterborough's story and how some of those elements perhaps are actually playing out in your city itself?
Of course. Thank you very much indeed. Is this on and you can hear me okay? Yeah? Good. We can't hear anything this way. If you wonder why we keep asking, because we can't hear anything. Okay. So yes, thank you for that introduction. I'll just do a brief introduction to Peterborough and what we're trying to do around the circular economy, and then very looking forward to the conversation. So Opportunity Peterborough is a private company, but we're owned by the local city. So we sit very much in that public and private space. And if you don't know Peterborough, just a quick sort of facts and figures of a city. We're actually quite a small city, only 190,000 population. But within that, we're very multicultural and diverse. So we have 140 languages spoken in the city. Fantastic assets and strengths there. We are one of the fastest growing cities in the UK. Now again, that's great opportunity, but creates challenges around resources and how we manage the city. Our approach to circular economy is very much people-based and, if you like, bottom-up, which is one of the expressions we heard from Paris as well. So just a slide there of the logo we use in the city and the 7 R's that we're trying to implement. 3 basic principles to our approach. First is, yes, it's a big goal. But actually, if you just show that and the expression circular economy to people, it's a bit scary. So we start looking at it bit by bit and build it and grow it. The second principle is that we like to grow it from within. So we get partners on board, particularly in the business and private sector community, to start to bring their thinking, because a lot of them are already involved with the circular economy, out to a wider marketplace. So growing it from within. And then the third principle, if this goes forward, whoa, too far, sorry, is providing the mechanisms and the opportunity for people to engage with the circular economy. And we were chatting a little bit before the panel session, and I've been amazed that I think if I was to go out into the street and say, hey, let's be a circular city, everyone would just think I'd gone mad. They'd expect me to take them to a roundabout in the city or something like that. But actually, if you say to them, have you got something you don't really need to use anymore? Have you thought of giving it a new use? Have you thought of doing something with it? Have you thought about sharing it? So we've established a platform called Share Peterborough. Now, there is a very basic side of it, which is about exchanging materials, products, etc. But we've taken it to the next level. So it's not just about sharing products. It could even be about sharing people. So between the businesses in the community, have they got apprentices that they would like to share with other companies? How do they use their staff to maximize those values and get them new experiences? We already have businesses offering property. Fascinated to see your slide of the skyscrapers of 40% occupancy, 20%, etc. We have found that in Peterborough. There's lots of people with lots of space they just don't use. They will put that on here because they'd rather another business benefited from it rather than just seeing it underused. So yes, it is a sharing economy system, but it's a bit more than that because we also want to hear best practice coming from it. So there's a learning process going on. So it is about starting with a big idea, bit by bit, growing it from within, giving the mechanisms to do it, and small picture of Socrates. I'm glad they showed that one because the picture looked a bit like me in 10 years' time earlier. So, reason I put this up is because Peterborough won the World Smart City 2015 last year based on our circular approaches. But really, we are here to learn. And I think this is one of the wisest statements I've ever seen or ever heard. And it is about knowing that we've got a lot more to learn. So thank you for the opportunity today. And I'm just going to absorb all the thoughts of my panel members as well. Thank you, Ashima.
Absolutely. Thank you, Steve. And echoing that, I want this to be as sort of beneficial a learning experience for all of you as well. So we're going to try and make this as interactive as possible. I do have a few questions sort of lined up for our panelists to dig into certain topics. But the more questions we get from the audience, the better. As Casper mentioned, you can send questions in through the app. But if you'd rather just go old school and use a mic, there are 2 over there, so head on over. I'll start off with a couple questions based on a few themes that I think have started to come through. Firstly, I'd maybe just to unpack this for the audience a little bit more, I think we heard a couple of concrete examples that came through. But could you perhaps quickly share your favorite example of the circular economy in a city, perhaps in different systems? I know, Owen, you mentioned sort of the elevator leasing example. You talked a bit about sharing. But any of the additional examples, just to really bring this to life for the audience? What does it look like to design for a circular city?
Who wants to start?
Chris,
Is it possible to go back to my slides? Just asked whether we could go back to my slides. So no, I can talk to some of the examples I had. I think, just going back to the sort of ultimate extreme of bottom up, because it's an area where we've been doing a bit of thinking, really around the the idea of a regenerative home and community. And this is not, as I said at the beginning, I'm here to learn as much as anyone else, and this is not going to be the answer to a circular city. But I think we're starting to see some interesting trends that will enable more circular behaviors, more regenerative behaviors even. And I think, when you look at some of the technologies converging around the home space in terms of potentially, moving to much more affordable renewables and energy storage solutions. This is a future-orientated session, so let's look out and imagine those things being more realistic and affordable. Let's look at the advent of these sort of micro distribution systems we're seeing in cities. Look at the miniaturization of manufacturing technology, smart materials, and you start to have some really interesting technologies sort of converging, I think, to fuel actually enterprise in the home in terms of, I think we'll be manufacturing and producing more of our own things. Now, there's going to be an enlightened self-interest in that. That's my view anyway. I think that people will be looking for more connection with what they make. I think there'll be more satisfaction in potentially being connected to people in local marketplaces, better quality of life for people's family. Maybe if they can get, for example, more locally produced food at local costs, at lower costs, and maybe even involving the children in growing the food in vertical farms in the bedroom. I don't know what it is. But I think that there's some interesting more circular behaviors that can be enabled as we see the economy continue to localize, obviously at different scales. And I talked about that at the beginning, the sort of, we'll be probably downloading a recipe to make something from the other side of the world. But I think we'll be participating more in our own home as an economy, because I think there'll be opportunities to create a better quality of life, and that may be around food production. It may be around producing things that we need to use in our lives, or such as hardware items. We may be much more engaged in the sharing economy in that respect as well. And I'm not just talking about expert making, because I think that's the whole point of these technologies. I think this is about, for example, one of the examples I had was this thing called BrewBot, which is this amazing godsend of a sort of domestic-sized appliance, like a kind of washing machine, where you literally press a button and it will make factory-quality beer, and you download the recipe. So I think there's some interesting examples of being able to, the technology coming along that's providing more of a platform for makers and producers in their own homes. And then if you think about creating marketplaces for these goods, that's incredibly interesting as well. So how might the community, how might the community enable more circular flows? And we're thinking about the kinds of more circular flows, enabling the flows of data that will enable the circular flows of, and enabling the circular flows of materials. And I think this is really interesting as well, if we lift out perhaps a bit out of the home, or at least a bit out of it, sort of the idea of personal usage of products, to thinking about what's the industrial legacy we have to deal with in cities. So if I'm in a German city in 20 years' time that's been decimated by the end of the car industry is based on high throughput linear systems, and we've now got a much more localized car industry in that German city around a shared mobility platform. There may still be wonderful opportunities for a guy who was a maker in that car industry to be a maker of parts for that new car system, maybe in his garage, with some of this 3D manufacturing technology, maybe connected to other makers of that type of products around the world. There's some very interesting industrial legacy issues and opportunities we can think about in terms of this highly kind of localized economy and making the most of that legacy. And also, of course, the cultural DNA of a city. So if you look at, for example, the Indian remanufacturing culture and how that will be such an amazing inspiration for the way they build circular cities, I should say, from scratch. So I think, just sort of in a nutshell, you might have some different early adopters of these kind of communities, the micropreneur who sees an opportunity to make and sell within that community, and how do we enable them? The community seeker, because we're talking about these communities having a lot more interconnected interests, so there may be somebody who wants that deeper connection. And then the prospector, this is potentially communities that are offering higher qualities of life in various aspects of life and what we want to experience in terms of those different forms of social, human, natural capital. So it's an incredibly exciting, I think, mountain that we're looking up, but very good reasons to sort of look up it.
Absolutely. Any additional examples to share that brings this to life a little bit? Yeah.
I come from and live in Amsterdam, which is a fantastically progressive city and a community also really it's interesting. I think mobility is something that we're really focusing in on. I grew up in the United States, and most of the cities and towns that I grew up in were all created after the invention of the automobile. So the way that the city has been designed is very different than the city I live in now, which is designed before the invention of the automobile. The streets are more narrow. Getting around in there is much more challenging, and we see smart vehicles and sort of smart mobility going through the city to be able to be an interesting alleviator of some of these congestion issues, also opening up much more green space into these communities. I'd like to talk a little bit about some initiatives that are taking place in Amsterdam, and we've had, for example, a neighborhood that I live in is called the Pijp, and this is really kind of the funky, creative, artistic area. And one of the things that's become very, very popular there is sort of these pop-up stores. But not talking about just pop up here and do whatever you want. In fact, to an extent, it is a little bit like that. What the municipality and what the city of Amsterdam has done has actually started to loosen restrictions on the permits for people to open up stores and shops in these areas. And they're enabling local communities to dictate whatever types of things are going to come in there. Now, in my neighborhood, there's a lot of artists. It is Amsterdam, so artists get carte blanche to do whatever they want to do in our city. And so you see these fantastic little weekly galleries popping up where the artists are displaying their work, selling their work. You have these gallery openings and parties taking place every week, and they're spilling out into the streets where people are meeting each other. Fashion designers, painters, photographers, all of these types of people are now congregating in these neighborhoods. And that's bringing in food and different types of food. We have lots of Ethiopian restaurants popping up in my neighborhood now. And so what you've seen is that by the city of Amsterdam to start loosening restrictions on dictating what will come into that neighborhood, but starting to say, look, this is a level of quality we want, but let the neighborhood really build itself and create its own identity and reinvent its own identity. I find that to be very exciting, and I very much love living in my neighborhood. So that's an example, and you know, I'll leave it with that for now.
Yeah, I think that's a fantastic point, and I think it really speaks to the principles of a circular economy, which are around flexibility and adaptability and this whole regeneration idea as well. So thank you for sharing, Steve.
And I think picks up the point about entrepreneurship
Yeah.
as well, which I think is really, really important, whether it's micropreneur or the more traditional industries as well. And actually, you'd like Peterborough, because that was built for the car as well, so you should come over. I could give you a number of examples around food, around water, around construction, but I'm actually going to do a very simple one. So thank you for this, and I've even got a prop with me. Thanks for warning in advance. So I'll give you a little story. There's a company in Peterborough. It's a smallish company, about 200 employees. It roasts coffee beans for the coffee industry. 1 in 7 of every cup of coffee drunk in the high street in the UK is roasted in this factory in Peterborough. And every week, they were sending 1,400 big Hessian sacks to landfill. Now, part of this story you'll have heard before around those that are using Hessian sacks for bags, but bear with me, because I think we tick about 3 or 4 of the 7 R's, if you remember from the diagram on this project. So a local entrepreneur went to a coffee company and said, why are you throwing away a good material, just sending it to landfill? Give me your sacks. I won't pay for them, just give me your sacks, I'll take them away and deal with them. And this local entrepreneur has set up a new company, so we've got a new company founded called Peterborough Reuse. And they make bags, was the first thing they started to make. These are available free of charge today on the exhibition stand over the road at Peterborough, just across there. And why it was so great was because the entrepreneur said, that's great, but I need to now remanufacture, re-engineer these coffee sacks. So he started a skills project in an area of deprivation in the city, reskilling, so that possibly should be the 8th R on that 7R list, reskilling local people to actually start manufacturing these bags so it could be sold and they could create a business out of it for themselves, a little micro business. Then they started to get calls from people like the highways team who said, well, actually, we need sacks for highways, for sandbags. So now it's getting orders for that as well. So what was landfill, through re-engineering, remanufacturing, we got a new business out of it, certainly recycling and re-engineering it, and actually it's just practical application of the principles which are developing the city even more. And that's one small example, and there's loads more, but I think it's a
Yeah.
nice one. But yeah.
Absolutely. Thank you for sharing that, Steve. And again, I think that speaks to one of the points that Chris brought up around the cultural DNA and industrial DNA as well of a city. I think that theme is really important to take into account because each circular city will develop differently. It'll pick up on different aspects of the circular economy based on sort of what the industry in the city is already doing or what the sort of assets are that exist in that city. So thank you for sharing that example. One overall theme, and there's actually a number of different questions which touch on this as well that I wanted to deep dive on, is around people and people in a circular economy. So ultimately, we are designing a city for its people, of course. You heard a great example from Antoinette Goul about how the citizens of the city and key stakeholders and so on were actually the ones who came forward and proposed various initiatives and so on the circular economy. I'd love to get all of your perspectives really on what the role of people is in people and citizens is in this transition to a circular economy, and how that plays into a circular city and designing for a circular city as well.
Shall I
Yeah.
kick off? I think it's really interesting that when you're working in a city, and I work in just one city, Peterborough, but we're trying to share our experience with others. It's getting over some mindsets. So actually, although we integrate a lot in terms of our initiatives and our services, there's still this temptation to compartmentalize. So there's a little compartment here called citizens. There's a compartment here called local government. There's another compartment here called local business. And actually, it's vital that we pull all of those together. So we started very much from a business community, but those businesses reach out to the wider community because they employ local people. So whether it's the coffee sacks, whether it's the people in the water industry, whether it's the companies that are looking at property, etc., they're starting to feed out into the local community. But it's not just the private sector, so looking at some of the third sector organisations as well. Housing associations are actually getting on board from the food perspective. How do we make better use of our food? How do we grow it locally, etc., etc.? So they're engaging their group of citizens, if you like. So for us, it's a case of, I think, slowly building and maturing as a city and using whatever route we can through that. Then I think it's seeing who else can add value to it. So for example, this small company doing the bags needed some property. Well, actually, it was then up to a local landlord to say, we like what you're doing, here's some free space, rent-free for a short period to build your business up. And I think that's the point. It's about building the energy, setting a vision, building the energy, and people will come to that. I think quite often we try and over-engineer it and feel this is going to be good for the people, let's push it out there. Much better if it comes from the people, and whether that's in any of the compartments, whether it's the local authority officer who's sitting at their desk trying to find new ways of doing things and empowering them, whether it's the people in the businesses that actually want to make a difference, and coming up from, we've heard it a few times, the grassroots, absolutely vital. And I think quite often we can over-policize it, put too much policy on it, too much engineering. Just give the opportunities and people will develop the new schemes.
Yeah, Ash, I think that this is a really great topic, and this is so important because collaboration is really the name of the game in the circular economy. Not collaboration only through businesses, but within value chains as well and within given processes. So a lot of people, one of the first questions that I get is, well, what does actually a developer do? What do you do? A lot of people don't know what we do. We're actually really coordinators. So we see an open piece of land or a neighborhood that could be a redevelopment. We have a vision on that works together with the local municipality to say, where is this city or area going? And then we organize finance, we organize construction teams, we organize architects, and we organize communities in order to realize that vision that we see. And so one of the things that we always start with is really engaging in something called a charrette. And this is really a broad-based community, almost town hall meetings, and a number of those to engage local stakeholders, even just people that live in those neighborhoods to find out more about their community, because it would be pretty arrogant for me to try and design a community not listening to the people that actually live there. So in that respect, we really want to gauge what is the historical value, what is the historical reference of these areas and these people's identity, very much that cultural aspect that Chris is speaking to. And then we really want to see of, okay, what role does this play in the redevelopment? One of the new projects that we're doing is something called the Valley. We organized a charrette of over 80 people for an entire weekend. We rented out an entire hotel in the woods in a town called Haza, and was in the woods, so it was this really kind of secluded environment. And we just asked people, what does the circular economy mean for you? And we had artists, we had government officials, we had the heads of universities and the heads of departments within those universities, CEOs, E-level business from major Dutch organizations, sustainability professionals, and we just started asking them what is the circular economy and asking them for their input to help us design this new development that we were going to create. So that type of collaboration in the creation of an idea or a concept is something that we always engage in. Now, to realize a structure, something like the ones that I've shown you today, takes a number of actors to be organized. And our world has become so competitive and so quick that, and so complex that it has forced us to become specialists. And we really specialize. I know what I do, and I do that very well. And you know what you do, and you do that very well. And, you know, I'll talk to you when I need you, and you talk to me, you know where my office is, you know, come try and get through that closed door. But what we really need is much more integration from these processes. And so we've created systems of how do we actually eliminate hierarchy in our whole process. And we have really condensed the production, the value chain and the production process of our developments. And this has been immensely valuable for us. We have reduced the cost of construction by 19% through collaboration in working together in the value chain. At the same time, we've been able to increase quality, which really drives our margins up. So it's also very good for our business as well. And so in that respect, getting people within the production process to collaborate with each other on single projects is also something that we see as immensely valuable, because innovation is quickly behind collaboration. Innovation is also a second name of the game, so to speak. And because of the complexity and speed of our world, it's almost impossible to innovate in a vacuum. By the time you get to market, the market has shifted and moved in a different direction, and all of a sudden that thought or idea that you have that you're developing is no longer relevant. So we see lots of collaboration between businesses to come with solutions as well. And even cross-industrial, insurance companies are now financing lighting to lease light on large-scale areas, and we see some very interesting collaborations in those levels.
So I'll try not to repeat myself from earlier. I mean, I think as I said, you know, it's so important that we think of the circular economy in cities as an opportunity to create a life system as much as an economic system, a life system that comes from the economic system. And I think there's some really interesting, you know, things that, you know, a developer of a huge new section of a city could be looking at in terms of creating those conditions, for example, for enterprise, for a more local base to manufacturing and production in all sorts of systems, you know, including food, including nurturing the sharing economy, including, you know, also kind of nurturing the manufacturing of goods as well. So I think that there's a lot that can be done there to kind of create that attractive community where people feel like they're gonna have a different kind of experience of living, and I think there must be a kind of a competitive advantage to kind of be offering that. I would suggest in today's world. So I think inevitably, you know, we're going to have to infect these city systems from within and from the side to an extent with these new development, these new regeneration opportunities in huge areas. So that's one thing. I love the angle you guys were taking as well around the collaboration between stakeholders. I think that's super interesting. You know, so much of the circular economy space is around changing mindsets. I think the idea of people working together to sort of grow the pie, to grow the health of a city economy without just looking after their traditional sort of silo interests is a much, much longer and more enlightened game to be playing in their own enlightened self-interest. And I think a lot of people are starting to work more like that. I guess the other thing I just wanted to touch on in terms of kind of nurturing kind of conditions is this idea of I know it's a little bit of a cliche, but I think they're an interesting analogy. So hack spaces. I'm sure many of you who are responsible for developing that kind of culture in cities have got them. But I think they're not. It's not just, we shouldn't look at them sort of literally in terms of where people are messing around with 3D printers. But I think that idea of a community being able to interact with others who are of a certain kind of sort of mindset, and I think that idea of building creative confidence, creative competitiveness at a people level in a city is very, very, very important for the future of circular cities. So how do we enable people to spark off each other? They may not all end up 3D manufacturers, but these kind of spaces are an interesting kind of nexus for conversations that can inspire different ways of thinking about business models, different ways of thinking about what people could be producing. So I think it's a really interesting aspect.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Chris. And Steve, maybe if you could just touch on that last point that Chris brought up in terms of we have to sort of enable this creative confidence. There's a lot that we need to enable essentially in order to design for a circular city and create sort of the right settings for that. Could you talk a little bit about this from sort of a policymaker or policy advisor's perspective? We've heard a little bit about sort of the bottom-up approach and the more organic grassroots initiatives and so on, and also, of course, about collaboration. But how about the top-down stuff? What exactly do you think the role of that city-level decision maker is in this?
Of course, thank you. First, to touch on that point about competitiveness and collaboration, key to both of them is understanding the benefits of the circular approach, and actually that applies to policy as well. So I think if we look at policy as there should just be a circular economy policy, there you go, it's on the table, that's not doing the job. So what we've done in Peterborough is actually, if you like, embed and integrate the circular economy principles into the policies, plural, of the city and the city council. So actually that's then helping the highways engineer who's planning for the next local transport plan for the next 5 years to see, hang on a sec, I'm meant to be looking at a circular economy issue here. What's the benefits of that? And now we are about to start what's called the first circular highway project in the UK. And that doesn't mean building a roundabout, just to get that joke out of the way quickly. It is about using the circular economy principles on a stretch of hard infrastructure road building. Now that's because we've started to embed into the policy makers of the City Council that thought process of the circular approach. It will underpin and be fed into the core strategy for the city. So when the city is looking at its next 5, 10, 15 years of growth, there is that policy line in there that says, when you're bringing forward development, how are you having a mind to the circular Peterborough agenda, ambitions and benefits scale? So rather than having a single policy, which is what I think some places are going, we're trying to embed it and weave it into all of the policies of a city moving forward. And I think, it can touch every single aspect. It could touch on housing development, it could touch on highways, it could touch on the environmental plans of a city as well. So I think that for us is the point, is that a single one might put people off, actually show the benefits to the policy makers and get them to weave it into their own policies, plural. And I think that's one, slightly less scary because you're seeing it incrementally growing, and two, it has that practical benefit. And for me, that's the point of policy. It isn't about the document that sits on the shelf, it's actually the practical implementation of the policy across the city which we're trying to influence.
Absolutely. Thanks, Steve. And Owen, your perspective on this too. From sort of the business angle, what are sort of the enabling conditions that you need from policymakers and so on? Is it that sort of strategy that falls across very different policies versus a one-off sort of enabler? What's your take?
Yeah,
on
that's
that?
a great question. I'm not for really the one-off type things, and we're much more about our vision as Delta as we look for sort of long-term vision. And that's a little bit more from us that steps into what we do in large-scale area transformation, is that we're active in communities for 10 to 30 years in helping to develop these large-scale areas. So for us, we really have to take a view, and it can, so I would think that the long-term view with consistent touch points all along the way to gauge on how are we doing, how is the community developing, are we really still in line, are there new developments or shifts taking place that we need to be aware of. These are really crucial for us to stay aware of. And so for at Delta, we're very much in favor of a backcasting technique where we go out and we try and envision, again, through these large charrettes, we try and envision what would be sort of an optimal condition and what are the targets, the goals, almost the North Star that we want to set. And then we can backcast to today that enables us to say, well, what do we need to do to just start getting going? But at the same time, what we know is that over 30 years, things are always going to change, but we still have that North Star where we wanted to get to on the point that's guiding us. And these North Stars primarily set through values and principles of the organization. So while cities change, activities change, hopefully our value set really don't change. You know, do right, do good, those types of things are pretty constant in our society. So those are really what guide us. And then as the winds change, we almost tack back and forth in this with our sails to adjust to the changes to keep going in the same direction. There's a fantastic example, by the way, in Holland. We are doing performance-based contracts, which is very much what the circular economy works on. And they're doing highways now where a company does the highway and they actually then also do all the maintenance, which is a great earnings model for them, but they only get paid the days that the lanes are open. So if they've done a bad job in designing and constructing the road and they need to continue to do more maintenance work, then they don't get paid those service contracts. So that's...
Learning.
So for me, policy really, and I get, in being a developer, I get to work a lot with governments. And of course, there's always that type of collaboration and also positive creative friction between private and public entities as well. And so what I've seen is in terms of challenges and then solutions to these challenges in terms of policy is that a lot of times policy is really there to set the conditions of the game that we should all be playing as citizens and as businesses and as communities. But sometimes policy layers up upon itself and we find policy for policy's sake. And when you find this going on, you start finding things like tendering processes. And we've been working with a government in Europe, I won't tell you which one, and we've been talking with them about a new project and they've said, well, we want you to help us for an open tendering of architects for the circular economy, and we want a local architect from our country, and we want 5 of them. Then we've said, well, you don't have any architects that have really done any projects, so why don't you bring in some outside architects in? And they said, no, well, it's in our tendering procedures and our policy that we must have local architects. So that spurred the question of really, what do you want? Do you want a fantastic project, and or do you really want a local architect? So what is it that your policy is set up for? Because if you want circular economy, then tender out for circular economy and make a condition that they work together with a local architect in order to impart that wisdom, in order to train them and teach them how to do these things. And that was almost like a mind-blowing moment for these governments because policy has been set up to serve as policy. And it's not about engaging intentions or realizing actions, but it's more about procedure. And that can be constraining. So one of the first things when we work with governments outside of our core markets as consulting agents is always to help them reframe what your intentions are and what your vision is, and then start your policy procedures for that given project from that set. And we've seen some fantastic examples like the City Hall of Venlo now. In Holland, we were always tendering for the lowest cost. What's the cheapest person to hit the lowest level of quality for the cheapest price in order to build a project, which is fundamentally flawed in terms of innovation and value creation and all of that. However, what they've done in Venlo is really interesting. They said, we as a city, this is our vision for City Hall. What team can realize our vision and make sure that you know what a budget is? So 70% of the weighted tendering procedure was who can answer my vision, 30% was show a little bit of your budget to make sure that you can do this reliably, in a fiscally responsible manner. And I find that to be very exciting. It won Tender of the Year in the Netherlands, and I think that this can be an example that other European countries can adopt in order to how you work with Brussels for these types of policy and procedures.
Great. I think we're actually going to shift to some of the many questions that have been coming in from the audience, so thank you for submitting. And if there are any people who do want to sort of step up to the mics and either offer a comment or a question, please do just wave over and we'll get there. The first one that's come in for Steve, and this does again touch on a lot of what we've already discussed, but what can larger cities such as Paris and London and so on learn from some of the things that you guys are doing at a slightly smaller scale? And in particular, the question's asking, can some of your citizen engagement strategies actually be scaled up at sort of the massive megacity level too?
A really good question. And I was born and bred in London, so if you don't mind, I'll use the London rather than the Paris equivalent. I love Paris. I've got nothing, just not been there. So born and bred in London. When I grew up in London, you always got the tube everywhere, and it was just this big amorphous blob of a city. I left London 20 years ago. When I go back and visit, what strikes me about London is that it is a series of interconnected villages or places. So the only advice I'd give is, if you like, we are all microcosms of each other. So actually, rather than trying to look at it as a panacea for a whole big major city, actually try and apply it to those areas which have distinctive identities in their own right. I'm sure Paris is similar. So actually working with, in London you've got the boroughs. Within the boroughs you've got the localities which have got very strong civic identity for those places. So the only thing I'd say is actually what we've done is worked with, if you like, obvious places where people agglomerate. So I'd use a similar model for London or Paris, is to actually find the places where there are commonalities that you can communicate at a level where they have a shared interest. And I think, yes, I mean, London for me is a series of interconnected villages, so actually play on that. Identify those, whether it's a residents association, whether it's community groups within that, whether it's where educational establishments work. Find those roots in, just drop the seed of what could be done, the point you talked about, vision there, and then see what comes from that. Because it won't be, your point about the cultural DNA of a city, you can have a cultural DNA of actually quite a small location within a city as well. Just let that sort of build off that cultural DNA, but just then help it through. So I'd work with the civic identity of a locality, the cultural DNA of that, non-prescriptive, and just maximize the opportunities which come. Because you won't just jump to a straight full circular economy or circular, it's build it bit by bit within the agencies that are working there.
Yep, absolutely. Great point, Steve. One's come in for Owen on Delta Development's work. Have you guys already taken a sort of technology and IT as an enabler into account in your design processes? How is sort of IT essentially acted as an enabler for all of you, given that we are today at the Smart City Expo as well?
Yeah, absolutely. So that is for sure one of the brave new frontiers that we really want to incorporate into our area developments. What we've done in our areas is primarily try to centralize first and foremost on a sort of a micro, large-scale level. Then let me explain that. So if we have, let's say, 5.5 hectares, then we have then a sort of centralized hot and cold storage system that's distributing heating and cooling throughout the buildings. Look at that almost as we use water, so we store water at certain depths in the earth so that it maintains a consistent temperature. And so look at that as almost that system like the heart, and then the pipes that connect all the buildings is almost a circulatory system. Now, we very much see the data as the brain, and the brain can really guide these optimal communities and buildings so that the buildings are interacting with each other and interacting with the environment, local communities. Something that we are also partnering with IBM on is to identify what can Watson mean into the built environment. And this is really exciting for us. And those that don't know Watson, it's cognitive computing. It's really computers that learn on its own and start to think. And Watson can actually look back historically and start identifying that we're selling more ham and cheese sandwiches in the month of October than we are in all the other months. So make sure that you're stocking up on ham and cheese in September to make sure that you can meet October's supply and demand. It can also start forecasting weather data and start helping people with their mobility strategies. So something that we are really interested in is not necessarily smart building technology and technology for technology's sake. That's expensive and at times makes it complicated. So you see these fantastic apps that people engage with the buildings and you have to sign in and log in order to play around with lighting. And so that's great for the first month. And then all of a sudden quickly you get pretty bored and tired of having to log in just to change the lights when all of a sudden, wouldn't you know it, there's a light switch right there. And people go back to almost the old way of doing things. So what we're really looking for our technology is something that we've coined as wise buildings instead of smart buildings. And these are buildings that learn from themselves and learn from their occupants. So how can the occupants dictate the behavior of that building? Think about a building that may look like it's breathing as it manages its own CO2 levels based on occupancy in certain areas. Buildings that open and close windows or window blinds based on weather patterns and longitude and latitude from how much sun and how much glare is coming into the buildings. So these are the technology aspects that we're really looking at. But again, technology for technology's sake, make sure that that technology links to the people, and that really is a key value driver of the work or the living or the retail, whatever is taking place in that structure.
Absolutely. Thank you, Owen. We do have a live question as well. If you could just introduce yourself and then share your question, that would be great. Thanks. Can we get the mics working? Or you can take this one? You can grab this one.
Is it old-fashioned? Is there a switch?
Here you go.
No?
Is that on?
Is that all right? Very sorry for the introduction. Rachel Lombardi, International Synergies, based in the UK. We're the developers of NISP, the industrial symbiosis model that's been implemented around the world. More from me tomorrow if you're interested in that. Just wanted to thank the panelists and the speakers this morning for very interesting perspective on the technique that we use, which is industrial symbiosis. It's very interesting to hear it and very gratifying to hear it gaining traction from the circular economy package at that level down to what Peter Burr is doing on the ground with your example around the bags and connecting the businesses. Of course, that's traditional NISP. That's exactly what we've been doing in the UK for 10 years and now around the world on 6 continents. So it's great to see it at both levels. I guess I would just add one word of experience, that going from the national to the supranational, down to the local, we do ground ourselves in, as has been said, the local context and the local culture and the local networks. But there is an economy of scale that we have found in every country so far, and that's North, South America, Europe, Asia, Africa, and Australia. There is an economy of scale to be had both in the innovation as well as simply in the productive capacity. So where are the technologies that you need? Where are the entrepreneurs working? So it's just an element to not lose track of as we bring this to ground in cities, make sure that the cities are talking between themselves. Thank you very much.
You know,
Absolutely. Thank you for your comment. And I'd love you guys to share your perspective on that.
You know, I was thinking about, as you were talking about this, and thinking about Paris as well, Antoinette, what you were talking about. And so I'm a businessman, and so I come from the private sector instead of the public. But doesn't this, what you're talking about, Steve, doesn't that sound a lot like alliance partnerships and joint ventures between large corporations when you're talking about boroughs working together? And so something that we've always taken from joint venture sort of network theory in public companies is that those that are most successful, look at Samsung and Sony and some of the collaborations that have taken place from there, are ones that have dedicated alliance managers. So somebody that is dedicated to understanding really the different boroughs and dedicated to be the first touch point in those areas. And in doing that, in setting up sort of these key positions within nodes of cities like the different sectors of Paris or the different sectors of London that are specifically tasked with engaging with the other sectors, that could be something to learn from the private world and how the public world could function.
Sorry, can I just quickly come back? And I think the point about economies of scale is absolutely right, but you've got to start somewhere. And for me, the expression I'd use is probably scale up. And so how do you, because you wouldn't want, if you're looking at London or Paris, as you say, particular sectors to just sit in isolation. That's not what I'm advocating. What I'm saying is that you start somewhere and you build it, and you're absolutely right. There comes with an economy of scale. And I think the example there you gave, Owen, of the sort of public and private coming together is where we learn from each other. Yeah. And that's the point for me, is actually how does the larger city help or be informed by the smaller, and how does it then take that smaller one through? And you'd look at exactly the same in the private sector models as well. So, yeah, for me it's scale up, but yeah.
Yeah, just briefly for me, I'm not an expert in the sort of industrial scale issues necessarily, but I think I wonder if the scale equation begins to look slightly different in the future. I think I'm not so sure that innovation is nurtured at scale necessarily. It depends how you look at it. I think there's obviously a question of scaling innovation. I think there's it's interesting to think about in a future of much more, distributed manufacturing, where things like IBM Watson are able to also communicate to those manufacturers, what materials are available kind of in an area, what the demand is, and help them be much more circular and smart in terms of that manufacturing equation at a local level. So I think there are some interesting things that maybe will come to challenge our traditional thinking about the benefits of scale. And I just think that those communities, I think where you're absolutely right, is those innovation communities at scale will be around that sort of storytelling, that kind of idea of how we can help people learn about what they can do from a kind of global community of people that are either through designing or not. One interesting example I forgot to give earlier was we're working with a major sports goods manufacturer who, within 10 years, will definitely have machines in homes that are able to allow people to sort of knit their own shoes, and that's totally not a pipe dream. That's totally something that's on the table. So I think for a lot of FMCG, companies, a lot of food companies, that question of kind of global scale just looks totally different in the future.
Absolutely. Thanks, Chris. So we are about to wrap up. I just wanted to perhaps get concluding thoughts from each of you, maybe just around 30 seconds on what we have to look forward to in terms of designing a circular city. How are your organizations actually taking some of the ideas that we've discussed here today and moving them forward? And any sort of last words for the audience as well. Thanks.
Oh, well, very, very briefly. I mean, what I love about the city space, it's the one area where, at IDEO we don't have an offer. I mean, we don't have a particular sort of capability that's focused on cities. So I'm just having fun, kind of exploring the space. I'm in the game of trying to sort of meet other people who are also exploring it, and I think we'll continue to think about human systems in the future and how they interface with technologies, and we're having kind of fun in that sort of design fiction space, and it's inspiring a lot of the other work we're doing in the circular economy, so it's really interesting.
Thanks, Chris.
Yeah, so to date, again, I'd like to confirm also and make sure to drive home that these things are not necessarily pipe dreams, that they are really taking place. We've to date built around 1 million square meters of real estate directly from circular economic and cradle-to-cradle inspired design principles just in the last 10 years. And these have been wildly successful. Our project, Park 2020, you looked at right now, has to be driven by market demand. So all of our budgets are market conform. We're 1.4% under budget. So anybody that goes out there and tells you that this is more expensive to do may not be looking at this properly. But it can be done on time and in budget. We've never missed a deadline for delivering a building before. Our exit yields to investors are outperforming the market by about 40 to 80 basis points per project. So these are wildly profitable projects to engage in. It's because people have never identified these value streams before. For where we're going next and what we're excited in is now we've found ourselves in an advantageous position. I'm a real estate developer. I've never started this to end up on a stage in Barcelona talking to an audience of people, but here we are. And something that we've found is really a necessity to actually start sharing this type of experience that we have. And something that we've done is we've created a separate organization, which is an advice and consulting agency, and We go to non-core markets in different European and global markets as well, and we work with local developers, local governments, local construction companies, and we do fee-based developing there. So we engage in a project, develop a real project that becomes then an example for a community, because buildings can be great examples. And then we teach everybody how this is how we make the business case. This is how we set the budget up. This is where we're doing in all of these types of things. And then the best thing as a consultant that we can do is become irrelevant. And it's teach a person to fish, not give a person a fish. And so that we can step back out of these communities, and then we have these local developers and local actors able to really build their community up. And so that's what we're really excited about now. And why I'm excited about that is because it really enables me to engage in a simple action, and that's do fantastic projects with my friends. And that's really how I want to do business. I love what I do, and I really just want to do cool projects with my friends. So that's what I'm excited about.
Sounds like a great philosophy. And Steve?
Come and do some in Peterborough, Owen. I think there are two things for me. One is, one that Owen touched on was about value. And I think the more we can do from events like this and from work the Ellen MacArthur Foundation and others, is about demonstrating the real value of this agenda, because I think that's often missed. And I think, for me, what is positive about the future and the next steps, but more and more those value chains will go out there and be better understood. And I think it isn't, as I say, going to be a panacea across everything, but it's where we can make that difference. So that's the first. The second thing for me, I think, going forward, the thing is, for me, is the excitement. And there is clearly excitement in the private sector, in the commercial world, in city systems, in authorities. There is excitement to make this happen. We were reflecting just before the panel that in Peterborough we've had lots of taglines and slogans. We are still trying to create the UK's environment capital. We're looking at principles of one planet living. We've got something called Circular Peterborough. But for me, the excitement comes when people can see that they can have an impact on that agenda. And that's that excitement of a practical implementation that I think is so telling. Less of the theory and policy, and more about that delivery.
Exactly. Thank you all thank you to our panelists. This has been fantastic. We're really looking forward to seeing more practical examples like that. And hope you do enjoy the next few days at the Circular Economy European Summit. And thank you again for your active participation as well.
And how great is Ashima, too? Thank you, Ashima, for doing all this. And Casper, of course.
Thank you, Owen. So thank you a lot to this panel. I think you would probably agree with me that this has been a very rich morning so far. I mean, we've heard about circular economy being the driver of innovation for the European Commission. We've heard about the bottom-up approach of Paris to overcome challenges. Peterborough sharing products, but even the experience of people. Delta's cities as material banks, and neighborhoods creating their own identity. And probably my favorite of the day so far is our home as our economy, and the ultimate local resource loops, downloading your own beer. And on that note, after the break, which will run to 12:50, so 10 to 1, we'll be back here in the room. And we'll be talking about more the perspective of regions. So we've looked at Europe, we've looked at cities, but there's of course a whole layer in between. So I look forward to seeing you back in, well, roughly 10 to 15 minutes. Thank you.